The mine that should never have been found. The hills of eastern Kentucky have always had a way of swallowing secrets. By day the land looks serene, rolling green ridges, crickets humming in the valleys, deer picking their way through misted creek beds. But when the sun sinks and the woods tighten around you, the silence feels wrong. Too heavy. Like the earth itself is listening. Locals will tell you that there are places you don't wander after dark, not because of wolves or bandits, but because the land remembers. And in Kentucky, memory runs deep. Just 43 miles from what would later be Lexington, there is one such place. On the oldest maps, it is marked only as Copper Basin. Today it appears on no official survey. The entrances have long since been sealed with government concrete, the ridges posted with rusted warning signs that read danger, unstable ground. But anyone who grew up in these counties knows that isn't why. The mine wasn't closed because it was dangerous to work. It was closed because of what investigators found when they finally went inside, and what they feared the world might learn if the truth ever spread. The story begins in 1792, the same year Kentucky entered the Union as the 15th state. It begins with 3 brothers, their bloody inheritance, and a mine so rich it should have been a blessing. Instead, it became a curse that would consume not only the Hartwells but hundreds of nameless souls whose bones still leach green into the soil. The brothers arrived. The Hartwell brothers were not pioneers in the romantic sense. They did not come west chasing freedom or farmland. They came because there was nothing left of them back east. Their father, Tobias, had been buried in a shallow Pennsylvania grave, his lungs blackened from years of breathing powdered copper and iron. Their mother had died trying to deliver a child that never drew breath. Poverty and poison had done the rest. Caleb, the eldest, was 34 when he led his brothers through the Cumberland Gap with a mule cart carrying little more than pickaxes, shovels, and a handful of notebooks filled with their father's meticulous scribbles. Silas, broad-shouldered and scarred from fights he never bothered to win, was 32. Jeremiah, the youngest, was 25 and looked like someone who belonged in a church pew, not underground with a lamp and hammer. But there was something in Jeremiah's eyes when he studied the hills, a kind of feverish hunger. He could read the layers of stone the way a gambler reads cards. Every fault line, every gleam of greenish stain across the rock face spoke to him. When the brothers first stood above the valley that settlers already called Copper Basin, Jeremiah pointed at the stone and whispered, "It runs deep, deeper than we've ever seen." They built their cabin high on a ridge, overlooking the basin. The walls were unusually thick, the windows narrow like arrow slits. The cellar they dug was so deep that neighbors joked they must be storing food for an army. The brothers only laughed, but their laughter didn't sound right. Neighbors also noticed something else. The Hartwells didn't just guard their claim, they fortified it. Anyone who came too close to their ridge found themselves stared down by Caleb with a musket resting casual but steady against his shoulder. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. The first vein by autumn of that first year, the Hartwells had cut their exploratory shaft. What they found inside was not copper, or as other miners knew it. This copper was laced with something else: arsenic, lead, even mercury. The mixture should have been worthless, poisonous, unworkable. Instead, it made their copper shine with a purity and strength that defied explanation. Samples sent quietly to Louisville came back with appraisals so high the assayers accused the brothers of fraud. The Hartwells knew better. They also knew the cost. Every handful of ore they chipped free carried death clinging to it, invisible but certain. They had watched their father cough blood for months before his body finally gave out. They had seen his hands tremble until he couldn't hold a spoon. They remembered the blue stain that crept up his skin like mold on bread. But the Hartwells did not turn away. Caleb looked at those shining veins of poisoned copper and saw not death, but opportunity. "We will outlast it," he told his brothers one night as they sat by the fire. "Others wasted their lives in ignorance. We will study it, master it. We will make the mine serve us, not the other way around." Silas nodded because he always did. Jeremiah wrote it down in the old family notebook. None of them seemed to consider whether they were making a pact with something they didn't understand. Jeremiah's sickness, the winter of 1794, was the first sign that the mine was claiming them. Jeremiah emerged from the shaft one morning with a splitting headache. By nightfall, his hands shook so badly he spilled water trying to drink. At first, his brothers called it exhaustion. But within weeks, his skin showed the telltale greenish discoloration their father had carried to his grave. Instead of begging for help, Jeremiah opened a fresh notebook and began writing. His entries were not cries for mercy. They were clinical records. Day 12, discoloration spreading from fingertips to elbow. Tremors worsened 3 hours post-exposure. Recommend limiting shifts to 8 hours to prolong functionality. That he was describing himself as though he were a test animal, not a man. Caleb encouraged it. Silas supplied whatever Jeremiah requested, strips of meat to test digestion, scraps of copper ground into powder for experiments. Neighbors later claimed they sometimes saw Jeremiah at dusk, standing shirtless in the snow, staring at his own hands as though they were foreign objects. He did not flinch at the cold. He only muttered into his journal while the wind tore pages loose and carried them into the trees. The doctor's visit in February 1795, Dr. Marcus Pendleton made the 3-day ride from Louisville after hearing rumors of a young miner wasting away. What he found in the Hartwell cabin disturbed him for the rest of his life. Jeremiah's skin had turned a blotchy green-blue. His teeth were loose. His eyes shook in their sockets. Yet when Pendleton recommended taking him back to Louisville for treatment, Caleb grew agitated. What medicines would you use? Caleb demanded. How long before recovery? Would the damage remain permanent? When Pendleton explained that much of the damage could not be undone, Caleb seemed almost satisfied. Permanent then, he muttered. The doctor realized, horrified, that they were not trying to save Jeremiah. They were studying him. Jeremiah himself, half delirious, confirmed it in a whisper, "We have to know how far it goes." Pendleton fled the cabin under the pretense of fetching more supplies. In his private journal he later wrote, "They are not victims of this poisoning. They are orchestrators of it. And they understand more about these metals than any miner I have ever met." The first death-spring thaw came with Jeremiah's collapse. Silas found him convulsing in the shaft, his fingernails blackened, his lips foaming. Caleb ordered Silas to wait before helping, scribbling furiously in the notebook as Jeremiah writhed. Only when the convulsions slowed did they attempt to drag him out. He died before sunrise. His final words were not a prayer, not a plea, but a note of observation. Vision narrowing, taste metallic, recommend shorter exposures for the next. Caleb buried him in an unmarked grave on the ridge. But not before opening him like a butchered hog to see how deeply the metals had rooted inside. His notes from that autopsy, later recovered by investigators, read like the inventory of a mine: liver heavy with copper deposits, lead discoloration in femurs, mercury visible in brain tissue. The Hartwells did not mourn. They recorded. And then they went back into the shaft. Bones in the dark. In the summer of 1797, while extending a new tunnel, Caleb and Silas struck something unexpected. Not ore, not stone, but bone. Dozens of them half buried in the walls. Ancient skeletons, green-stained and brittle, as if the earth itself had been gnawing them for centuries. Some were adult. Some were not. Jeremiah's notes had spoken of the mine as a curse unique to their bloodline. But these bones told a different story. Others had been here long before. Others had suffered the same sickness. And some, judging by the healed deformities in their bones, had survived for years before dying. To Caleb, this was not a warning. It was proof. Proof that survival was possible if managed with precision. Proof that their family had not stumbled into death by accident, but into knowledge hidden in the earth for generations. That night, Caleb made a decision. They would not be the last Hartwells claimed by the mine. They would be the first to master it. And from that moment, the Hartwell mine ceased to be a place of labor. It became a laboratory. The valley grows quiet. By 1798, neighbors noticed something strange. The Hartwells no longer came into town. They no longer hired laborers. Smoke still rose from their chimneys, or still traveled downriver under different names. But no one saw who hauled the wagons. That night, from the valley floor, settlers reported hearing cries. Not the cries of men in pain, but of children. Thin, high, endless cries that drifted through the trees and made even hunting dogs whine and retreat. When one farmer confronted Caleb about the sounds, Caleb smiled in a way the man never forgot. "It's only the mountain settling," he said. "The earth shifts. Sometimes it sounds like voices." But the farmer's wife whispered what everyone else already feared: "Earth doesn't scream for its mother." And so the valley grew quiet because people stopped asking questions. But the mine was far from quiet. Inside those tunnels, the Hartwell experiment had only just begun. The children beneath the mountain. The Hartwell brothers should have been ghosts by 1800. Copper mixed with arsenic, lead, and mercury was never meant to sustain human life. It was meant to unmake it. Yet Caleb and Silas were still alive, still pulling their cursed wealth from Copper Basin, and still writing in the notebooks Jeremiah had left behind. They were wasting, yes. Their teeth ached loose in their gums, their skin bruised with unnatural green-black stains, their hands shook whenever they tried to sign their names. But they endured. Because Caleb had learned something Jeremiah never lived long enough to grasp. Death could be postponed. If you understood the poison well enough, you could stretch your life like leather on a rack, buying months, maybe even years. The trick wasn't avoiding exposure. The trick was controlling it. But that discovery came with another realization. One Caleb whispered to Silas in the dark one winter's night while snow piled against the cabin walls. If it works on us, it will work on others. If we are willing to study it, to test it, we might find the line between survival and ruin. From that night on, the Hartwell mine no longer existed merely to produce copper. It existed to produce answers, at any cost. The disappearances. The frontier was a place where people vanished all the time. Men went hunting and never came back. Children wandered too far from the cabin and were lost to the woods. Families packed up and left for richer soil without leaving so much as a farewell note. Which is why no one asked too many questions when drifters who had been hired by the Hartwells to move supplies never reappeared. Or when immigrant families passing through the Cumberland Gap left town one laborer short after selling their mule. But in the valley, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, neighbors noticed patterns. The Hartwells seemed to need chains, locks, medical tools, barrels of vinegar and saltpeter in quantities that made no sense for 3 men mining alone. And sometimes travelers heard the unmistakable cries of children echoing from the shaft at night. The first witness, Martha Hensley, was only 19 when she married her husband William and moved onto farmland 2 ridges from the Hartwell claim. She was a plain-spoken woman, not prone to fancy or fear. But in the summer of 1802, she gave a sworn statement to the county clerk that remained sealed for more than a century. We'd hear them, she testified, not the Hartwells but the little ones, crying like they were burned or whipped. Crying so long it turned to screaming, then turned to nothing at all. My William went once, after midnight, to ask what was happening. He came back white as milk, saying Caleb met him with a rifle and said it was the mine settling. But William told me later, in whispers, Martha, equipment don't beg for its mother. Her account might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a frightened frontier wife, if other neighbors hadn't begun saying the same. The recruitment. Caleb knew secrecy was everything. If too many strangers vanished too quickly, suspicion would bury the mine faster than a cave-in. So he was careful that he made contacts. Slave traders in New Orleans willing to sell damaged stock. Men and women too sick or rebellious for plantations. Immigration agents in Baltimore who looked the other way when a newly arrived orphan was placed with an employer. Even bounty men who could snatch a child from an isolated farm and disappear before anyone thought to blame Kentucky Hills. The notebooks record the euphemism Caleb favored, acquisitions. He calculated costs the way a merchant calculates grain, by age, condition, and experimental suitability. A strong man of 25 might fetch $40 on a southern auction block. Caleb paid $12. A sickly girl of 14 might cost $6. To Caleb they were not human beings. They were investments. Silas, for all his brute strength, was the one who brought them up the ridge. Witnesses later described his horse-drawn cart moving by night, covered with canvas, no lantern light. Dogs whined when it passed, the underground city. By the time railroad surveyors broke into the tunnels decades later, they described what they found as a subterranean city. In 1803 it was only beginning. But Caleb had vision. He designed not just mining shafts but chambers, rows of crude stone rooms, each with iron rings hammered into the walls. Ventilation shafts disguised as hollow trees above ground. A drainage system carved through limestone to carry filth away. That it was not a mine. It was a prison. The captives were divided into groups. The strongest worked near the front shafts, hauling or under Silas's watchful eye. Those who showed early signs of poisoning, tremors, rashes, nosebleeds, were moved deeper into the tunnels where Caleb observed and recorded them. Children, too small for hard labor, were kept separately, their growth and deformities tracked with obsessive precision. Every cough, every bruise, every fever was measured. Some were forced to eat copper filings mixed with food. Others drank water steeped in crushed ore. When they weakened, Caleb scribbled notes in his precise hand. Subject 14, male, age 9. Hand tremors began after 11 weeks. Skin tone shifting to bluish. Retain in chamber for continued observation. The storekeeper's suspicion the Hartwells rarely came into town, but when they did, it was always Caleb who bargained. Samuel Wickham, the local storekeeper, began to wonder why men who supposedly worked alone bought so many chains. So much canvas. So much vinegar. When he asked, Caleb answered smoothly, equipment maintenance. Or transport. Preservation. But Samuel noticed something else. Occasionally, with Caleb's wagon parked outside, He caught a glimpse of movement beneath the canvas. Once, he swore he saw the outline of a child's hand pressed desperately against the fabric before being yanked back into silence that he told his wife what he saw. She told him never to mention it again. The bones on the ridge in 1823, surveyor Samuel Crawford stumbled on shallow graves while mapping county lines. What he uncovered made his team retch. Rows upon rows of bodies, most of them children, their bones stained green as if the earth itself had poisoned them. Officially, Crawford's report was vague. He wrote only of unmarked burials. But in a private letter to his brother, he confessed the truth. The Hartwells left behind evidence of systematic murder. The little ones. I cannot write further without fear that he sealed the graves back over, perhaps hoping silence would smother the truth. But by then, the Hartwell operation had already devoured its second generation of victims. Caleb's transformation. By 1825, Caleb was no longer entirely human. His skin was a patchwork of mottled green and gray. His teeth had blackened. His handwriting shook across the page, though the content remained coldly meticulous. Yet he lived. Decades beyond what Jeremiah or their father had managed. He attributed it to his protocols, a strict regimen of exposure and rest, ingestion and purge. He had turned poisoning into a science and himself into proof. Silas was less fortunate. His body began to warp, shoulders hunched, hands curled into claws. He could no longer swing a pick without pain, but he continued hauling captives deeper into the tunnels. To outsiders, the brothers had become reclusive eccentrics. To those beneath the mountain, they were wardens. And to Caleb, they were pioneers. Children of the mind. The most disturbing entries in the Hartwell journals are not about adult victims. They are about the children born underground. By 1810, women among the captives had begun giving birth. Caleb saw this not as tragedy but as opportunity. He wrote, second-generation subjects demonstrate increased tolerance. Skeletal deformities present, but longevity greater. Suggest breeding program to enhance survivability. The journals describe infants raised in chambers with controlled exposure. Their skin discolored almost from birth, their bones twisted but strong. Caleb noted which ones survived longer in the toxic air. By 1830, he wrote proudly of a line of subjects capable of laboring for years before collapse. Neighbors whispered of sickly children glimpsed near the mine at dusk, eyes too large for their faces, limbs crooked yet resilient. When asked, Caleb would smile and say, family inheritance. But none of these children ever appeared in baptism records. None were buried in churchyards. They existed only beneath the mountain. The voices from the earth. By the late 1830s, Copper Basin had become a place locals avoided even in daylight. Travelers swore they heard voices drifting up from the mine, pleas for help, the wailing of children, even songs sung in cracked, broken tones. Some claimed they saw lantern light moving through the hills when no Hartwell was present. Others said the air stank of metal and rot, as though the mountain itself was exhaling the stench of death. The valley's farms withered. Families moved west, unwilling to raise children near land that seemed cursed. Only the Hartwell Ridge remained inhabited, its cabin fortified, its chimneys still belching smoke. The cries, however, never ceased. The railroad discovery in 1834, progress came to Kentucky in the form of the Louisville-Nashville Railroad. Engineers drilled into hillsides to test foundations. Near Copper Basin, one drill broke through into empty space 30 feet down. When workers lowered lanterns, they found not a natural cavern, but hand-carved tunnels stretching further than their light could follow. Inside lay shackles, rings bolted into stone, and walls dark with stains that were not rust. And deeper still, chambers lined with bones, some child-sized, their surfaces tinged green. The railroad surveyors fled. But what they had uncovered was only the first layer of the Hartwell labyrinth. The deeper chambers, the breeding pits, the termination rooms, those remained hidden, waiting for another generation to stumble upon them. And above ground, Caleb Hartwell, nearly 50 years into his poisoning, still lived. Still writing. Still waiting. Because for the Hartwells, death was not an ending. It was a variable. The network in the shadows. By the mid-1830s, Copper Basin was no longer just a frontier mine. It was a machine. A machine that consumed lives, refined knowledge, and exported wealth. The Hartwells had transformed from miners into architects of a system that reached far beyond the Kentucky hills. But if the valley was a furnace, then the sparks it threw off were beginning to land in places where they could not be ignored. And that was the most terrifying truth of all. The Hartwells weren't working in isolation. They were not deranged hermits clinging to a cursed mine. They were part of a larger pattern, a network whose tendrils were already worming their way into the young nation's arteries. the silence of the valley. By 1835, settlers had abandoned almost every farm within 5 miles of the Hartwell claim. The soil was still fertile, the streams still ran, but families whispered of shadows moving at night, of shrieks carried on the wind, of children glimpsed on ridgelines who never seemed quite right. Local officials recorded a curious pattern. Copper Basin appeared on tax rolls as productive land, yet no one in town had seen or hauled openly in years. No carts rattled down the pike with copper ingots. And yet, in Louisville, shipments of nearly pure copper appeared under various names, routed through middlemen no one could trace. Caleb's ledgers, later pried from the tunnels by railroad engineers, made the truth plain. Copper left the valley on hidden wagons, traveled to river docks under falsified bills of lading, and disappeared into the Ohio River trade. From there, it entered markets in New Orleans, Baltimore, even New York. The mine was not failing. It was thriving in silence. The letters, the most damning discovery in the Hartwell archives, wasn't a bone or a chain. It was ink. Letters written in Caleb's precise, educated hand, though by the 1830s his script trembled with age and illness. The letters were addressed not to neighbors or merchants, but to men identified only by initials or symbols. They contained requests, updates, and cold calculations. One, dated 1837, inventory, 19 active subjects, 6 nearing termination. Request replenishment of 12 to 15 suitable replacements. Children of second generation demonstrate increased tolerance. Note: 1 female age 11 has survived 28 months under exposure with minimal decline. Another letter, 1839. Copper shipments secured via southern route. Payments arranged through Baltimore contact under seal. Continued delivery of materials for surgical observation. Demand for fertilizer byproduct increasing. Recommend expansion. The implications were staggering. The Hartwells were reporting to someone. And they were being supplied. The fertilizer business, perhaps the most grotesque branch of the operation, was also the most profitable. The disposal. Bodies did not simply rot in shallow graves. They were processed. Ashes and powdered bone mixed with lime, sold quietly as agricultural supplement. Farmers who never set foot in Copper Basin unknowingly spread the remains of Hartwell victims across their fields. Crop yields rose. The trade grew. To those who bought it, the substance was just another fertilizer. To Caleb, it was efficiency, turning waste into profit, death into growth. His notes spoke of it with chilling pride: nothing wasted. Even in termination, the subject yields utility. By the early 1840s, Kentucky farms as far as 60 miles away were unknowingly enriched by human remains. The nation's breadbasket was being seeded with bones. Dr. Muller's realization when German physician Heinrich Müller was shown fragments of Hartwell documents years later, he nearly refused to believe them. The dosage tables, the anatomical sketches, the careful progression charts. This was not the work of self-taught miners. This was medicine decades ahead of its time. Müller recognized something even more chilling: parallels with experimental notes circulating quietly in European industrial circles. He had read rumors of labor trials in Prussian mines, of endurance tests on factory workers in Manchester. The Hartwells' work was not unique. It was part of a broader hunger for knowledge, the kind that saw workers less as men and more as material. It meant the Hartwells had either been influenced by, or had influenced, an international conversation about human experimentation. And if they had correspondents in Baltimore and New Orleans, who was to say the network stopped there? The federal interest. When railroad engineers stumbled upon Hartwell tunnels in 1834, they filed their discovery in dry, bureaucratic terms. But word traveled quickly. And soon, fragments of their reports reached federal ears. By 1836, quiet inquiries were made. Why were shipments of copper from Kentucky so untraceable? Why were certain merchants in New Orleans paying premiums for product that seemed to appear from nowhere? Why did official county records list hundreds of unexplained disappearances near the basin? Investigators rode into the hills under orders of silence. What they found was enough to alarm even hardened men. Shackles and stone. Blood-stained walls. Ledgers filled with initials. But they also found something else: resistance. The Hartwells were no longer just two brothers. The tunnels were inhabited by dozens. Some deformed, some silent, some who seemed to obey Caleb's every command. Whether born underground or broken into submission, these second-generation captives fought like men defending their home. The investigators retreated. Their reports vanished into federal archives. The mine entrances were marked for future review. The expanding pattern. But the Hartwells were not the only ones. That became clear when federal men compared notes from across the young republic. In Pennsylvania, mass graves near coal towns showed the same green-stained bones. In Virginia, records of ironworks listed sudden surges in productivity matched by unexplained spikes in worker deaths. In Tennessee, rumors of mines guarded like fortresses whispered of special labor. The pattern was unmistakable. Other families, other operations, perhaps smaller but disturbingly similar. Were they all connected? The Hartwell letters suggested yes. One fragment of correspondence, dated 1841, reads, "Recommend coordination with Tennessee contact. His stock has proven resilient. Awaiting word from Northern associates on endurance trials in coal seams." The Hartwells weren't lone monsters. They were nodes in a web. The children who survived the most unsettling testimonies came not from letters or bones, but from those who escaped. A handful of malnourished children staggered into neighboring counties in the early 1840s, their skin blotched, their teeth dark, their stories incoherent. They spoke of endless tunnels, of the green sickness, of being told they were born to serve the mine. One boy, perhaps 12, was recorded by a missionary before dying. "The man with the black teeth said we was chosen. Said we was proof the sickness could be beat if we stayed long enough. He said if we died, others would come after. Always more." Locals dismissed these survivors as mad. Their bodies were burned to prevent contamination. Their words buried with them. But their existence proved what Caleb's journals boasted. A generation had been raised in the dark, bred to endure the poison. The price of secrecy. By 1843, the Hartwell operation was straining under its own weight. Caleb's health was failing. His notes grew fragmented, his once sharp calculations smeared with trembling strokes. Silas had degenerated into a hulking figure barely recognizable as human, his jaw swollen, his skin split with lesions. Yet still they wrote. Still they ordered new shipments of acquisitions. Still they processed bodies into fertilizer or into profit. The network they had joined or perhaps created was still hungry. And Caleb, even dying, was determined to feed it. The last entry before collapse on December 23, 1844, the final entry in the Hartwell ledger appeared. The script was weak, almost illegible, but the words were chilling. "Last of outside stock expired this morning. Thomas and Samuel near termination. I alone maintain records. Hands shake too badly to continue full observations. But experiments successful beyond expectation. Techniques extend productive life by 400%. Work must not be lost. If no heir remains, others must inherit. The bloodline ends with me. But the knowledge does not." Signed, C. Hartwell III. The implication was clear. A third generation had lived and died in the tunnels. And the knowledge, the records, the techniques. Caleb believed they had already passed beyond Copper Basin. When federal men returned in 1847, they sealed the mine forever. Officially, geological instability. Unofficially, because what lay inside proved America's prosperity had been built on more than copper. It had been built on blood. But if Caleb was right, Copper Basin was only the beginning. The Hartwell curse had spread. And somewhere out there, others were still keeping the work alive. The termination chambers. By the time the Louisville-Nashville Railroad surveyors accidentally broke into the Hartwell tunnels in 1834, the family itself was already withering. Caleb's body was collapsing under decades of poison. Silas was a disfigured brute whose voice had dwindled into guttural mutters. And the children born underground, their supposed second generation, were aging into broken shadows of men and women who would never see the sun. But the tunnels outlived the bloodline. And what investigators eventually discovered inside those tunnels revealed that the Hartwells hadn't just mined copper. They had mined humanity itself, systematically, efficiently, and without mercy. What lay beneath Copper Basin wasn't a mine. It was a factory of suffering. The hidden passage. When federal agents finally returned in 1847, armed with Caleb's confiscated records and guided by railroad maps, they knew they were not entering a normal mine. But nothing prepared them for what they crawled into. Behind a narrow shaft, so tight they had to drag themselves on their bellies for nearly 100 yards, they entered a sealed system of chambers. The air was thick with coppery dust and something sweeter, rotting, clinging to the tongue. Their lanterns cast wavering light across walls marked with crude symbols, tally marks, and stains that no one wanted to identify. It was here they found what Caleb's records called the termination chambers. The medical room. The first chamber was small, almost clinical in its design. Crude wooden tables lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by blades. Iron restraints were still bolted in place. Scattered across the floor lay rusted instruments. Saws, clamps, glass vials clouded with residue. On the walls hung charts, hand-drawn diagrams of bodies, bones, organs. Notes in Caleb's precise script detailed the progression of poisoning, the optimal periods of labor, the ways to prolong function before collapse. One agent, hardened from years of military service, was seen retching violently when he read an entry aloud. Subject 22. Respiration shallow, body failing. Applied heated copper filings to wound to observe reaction. Subject endured an additional 4 hours before expiration. Recommend refinement of method for future trials. This was not a healer's room. It was a workshop of torture disguised as medicine. The living chambers beyond the medical room, investigators found wider caverns carved with shocking precision. Rows of alcoves had been cut into the stone, each barely large enough for a body to crouch or lie down. Iron rings were hammered into the walls beside each alcove. Chains lay rusted in piles, stained dark. The stone around the rings bore grooves, indentations worn by wrists and ankles that had strained against iron for months, years. Some alcoves contained skeletal remains still curled in the fetal position, bones green-stained and brittle. Others were empty, but the floor dust was thick with fragments of teeth, fingernails, and clumps of matted hair. It was clear these chambers were not temporary prisons. They were habitats. People had lived and died here in the dark, their lives measured not in years but in exposure intervals. The layout of the chambers told a story. Those nearest the shafts contained the strongest skeletons, broad frames, thick bones. Laborers, likely forced to extract or until their bodies gave way. Further back, smaller remains, children, many no older than 8 or 9. Their bones showed deformities that spoke of long survival under constant poisoning. Bowed legs, swollen joints, skulls elongated unnaturally. Caleb had raised them like livestock, documenting every stage of their deterioration. The deepest alcoves housed twisted remains that barely looked human, bodies that had survived far past natural limits, warped into unrecognizable forms. Caleb's notes confirmed it. These were long-term survivors, studied until their bodies finally collapsed. The mine was not just a workplace. It was a laboratory for human endurance. The disposal chambers, the investigators' lanterns eventually illuminated the final horror. Chambers blackened with soot, their stone walls coated with the residue of fire. Primitive furnaces, still holding cracked copper pans filled with ash. Grinding stones smeared with pale dust. This was where the Hartwells disposed of their victims. Not by burying them, but by rendering them into commodity. Soil samples taken decades later revealed the truth. Human ash mixed with lime, crushed bone ground into fine meal. Caleb had not wasted a single body. He had converted suffering into profit, selling the remains as fertilizer to farmers across Kentucky. The ledgers made it plain. Output, 317 units processed between 1805 to 1843. Distribution secured via Louisville broker. For nearly 40 years, fields across the region had been seeded not only with crops, but with the remnants of the mines dead. The ashes in the soil. When historians analyzed agricultural records from the period, a chilling correlation emerged. Farms that had purchased from certain brokers showed unusually high yields during the first half of the 19th century. These gains could not be explained by weather, seed, or farming technique. The difference was chemical. The land had been enriched by human remains carrying trace metals from years of poisoning. Generations of Kentucky children ate bread grown from soil fertilized by the dead of Copper Basin. And most never knew. The knowledge preserved. The most disturbing discovery wasn't the bones or the ash. It was the ledgers. Hundreds of pages meticulously preserved in stone boxes, waterproofed with wax. Caleb had prepared them for posterity. Each page cataloged an experiment. Dosage, symptom, duration, productivity. Side notes contained formulas for prolonging life, mixtures of vinegar and sulfur to counter tremors, controlled diets that slowed poisoning. It was medical research, brutal, primitive, but decades ahead of its time. Knowledge extracted not from rats or dogs, but from hundreds of human beings. Dr. Muller, reviewing the ledgers a generation later, admitted through clenched teeth, "This is data even we do not yet possess." That admission changed everything. Because it meant the Hartwell work had value. Horrific, undeniable value. The cover-up federal authorities faced an impossible decision. Expose the Hartwells and the young nation would learn that its copper wiring, its farm harvests, its industrial growth had been built on systematic murder. Or bury the truth, seal the mine, and quietly absorb the knowledge into legitimate industry. They chose silence. The entrances were collapsed and sealed with concrete. Official records claimed geological instability. All surviving ledgers and artifacts were transferred to secure federal custody, where they remain locked away. Witnesses were reassigned, silenced, or quietly discredited. Copper Basin vanished from maps. By the Civil War, most Kentuckians had forgotten it entirely, except for the whispers of the screaming mine. The legacy of the victims, but the victims did not vanish. Their bones still lie beneath Kentucky soil, their chemical traces still detectable in farmland. More chillingly, their genetic line may not have ended. Some of the second-generation children born in the mine were never accounted for. A handful may have been absorbed quietly into frontier communities, carrying in their blood a tolerance for toxins and deformities inherited from generations of exposure. Local legends speak of families in eastern Kentucky whose children were born wrong. Their skin tinted strangely, their bones brittle but their endurance uncanny. No one dared connect them to the Hartwells. But whispers lingered. The question remains, did the Hartwells succeed in breeding something new? Something that still walks among us, descended from the mine's dark nursery? The question of expansion. The Hartwells may have died in their tunnels, but their work did not. Letters seized from the mine proved correspondence with other operators. In Tennessee, Pennsylvania, even Virginia. The network Caleb alluded to was real. That if the Hartwells were only one node, then Copper Basin was not the whole story. It was only the beginning, and federal investigators, staring at green-stained bones and ledgers of torture, were forced to confront a terrifying possibility. How many other mines across America were hiding their own chambers? How many farms had been seeded with the ashes of human suffering? And how much of America's prosperity, its railroads, its telegraphs, its factories, was built not just on labor, but on murder carefully hidden beneath the earth? The Hartwell mine had been sealed. But the network was still out there, and some of its secrets may still be alive. The network. When the Hartwell tunnels were sealed in 1847, officials congratulated themselves on containing a nightmare. They thought Copper Basin had been an aberration, a single, isolated horror on the Kentucky frontier. But the ledgers told a different story. The Hartwells hadn't worked alone. And what investigators found in the decades that followed suggested that Copper Basin was not an accident of cruelty, it was a prototype that others had already copied. The letters that shouldn't exist buried within Caleb's wax-sealed boxes were fragments of correspondence. Letters written in code, half-burned, but unmistakable in implication. Point 1, dated 1822, bore the seal of a Pennsylvania ironworks owner. It congratulated Caleb on his yield ratio per subject, and offered to exchange ash preparation techniques. Another, and signed, carried the cryptic line, Tennessee site reports 43 processed this quarter. Conditions optimal. Recommend expanding holding capacity. The Hartwells weren't just writing to each other. They were part of a network. A fraternity of industrialists trading methods the way farmers traded seeds. And if Caleb's records were accurate, Kentucky was only one branch. The Pennsylvania furnace in 1852, nearly 5 years after Copper Basin was sealed, railroad workers outside Pittsburgh reported finding a tunnel system beneath an abandoned iron furnace. Inside they found crude alcoves eerily similar to those at Copper Basin, though most had long since collapsed. Among the rubble lay bones, thin, warped, chemically scarred. The official explanation? Animal remains, likely refuse from butchering. But the copper stains on the stone, the restraints in the alcoves, and the presence of ledgers, quickly confiscated, told another story. This wasn't animal refuse. It was the remains of another experiment. And it suggested that the network Caleb wrote of had spread north, into the heart of America's steel country. The Tennessee Pits whispers also circulated in Tennessee. Miners in 1861 uncovered a sealed cavern beneath a copper pit near Ducktown. Inside were stacked wooden crates, each filled with a fine white powder. Locals assumed it was lime for treating ore. But when a doctor examined the substance, he identified fragments of human bone mixed with copper residue. The crates vanished overnight. Federal troops guarding the mine insisted the discovery had been requisitioned for the war effort. The matter was never revisited. Yet local families swore they could hear voices echoing from beneath the ground for years afterward, low, guttural cries that sounded almost human. Virginia's whispering hollows, the Appalachian hollows of Virginia, carried their own legends. During the 1870s, travelers spoke of fields where no crops would grow, though the soil was black and fertile. Locals avoided these areas, calling them screaming fields. They said on certain nights, the ground seemed to hum as if the soil itself was remembering. When historians cross-referenced these sites with shipping records, a pattern emerged. Farms enriched by fertilizer shipments from shadowy brokers connected to Kentucky and Tennessee. The ash of the dead had fertilized more than crops. It had seeded legends that a national pattern by the 1880s, enough fragments had surfaced to sketch a terrifying map. Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia. Each site followed the same blueprint: an industrial front, a mine, furnace, or pit. A hidden chamber, sealed, concealed, or collapsed. Evidence of bodies processed into ash. Correspondence linking back to Copper Basin. The Hartwells weren't aberrations. They were the Kentucky branch of a larger fraternity that thrived in America's shadows. And their methods, document, refine, conceal, profit, had been replicated across the young nation. The federal dilemma. By the dawn of the 20th century, federal officials faced a truth too monstrous to speak aloud. The prosperity of the United States had not been built solely on steel, cotton, and ingenuity. It had been fertilized, literally, by human remains. Every time the story threatened to surface, it was smothered. When Tennessee miners spoke out, they were branded drunkards. When a Pennsylvania newspaper tried to print an exposé, the presses were seized under national security grounds. The government had chosen silence not once but repeatedly, because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that American wealth carried an unthinkable origin. The surviving lineages. The most unsettling discovery came not from bones, but from blood. Doctors in Kentucky and Tennessee began noting strange medical anomalies in isolated families. Children with unusually high resistance to heavy metal poisoning. Adults who could endure chemical exposure that crippled others, generations of deformities, elongated skulls, fused joints, greenish skin tints, paired with uncanny endurance. These families were written off as mountain oddities, blamed on inbreeding or malnutrition. But the patterns mirrored Caleb's own notes on the second generation, raised underground. Some of the Hartwell children had escaped the mine. And they had bred. The network in the modern age. The final twist came in 1911, when a congressional aide stumbled across a sealed archive while cataloging old documents. Inside were fragments of Caleb's letters, along with newer correspondence from men who had never set foot in Kentucky. One letter, dated 1896, mentioned transitioning from crude extraction to medical testing. Another described using urban populations as a renewable source. This wasn't about mines anymore. The network had adapted, evolving alongside America's industries. What began in Copper Basin had shifted into cities, factories, and eventually institutions. The Hartwells were gone. But their methods had survived. The unfinished map. When the aide presented the archive to his superiors, it vanished within days. The aide himself died in what was officially recorded as a railway accident. But before he died, he had copied a single page. A map. The map showed dots scattered across the United States: Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Virginia, but also Illinois, Missouri, New York, even California. Each dot was labeled not with a company name, but with a family surname. The Hartwells had not been alone. They had been part of an entire network of families. And some of those names are still among America's wealthiest today. The legacy. The discovery of the Hartwell tunnels in Copper Basin was supposed to be the end of the story. Seal the mines. Burn the ledgers. Call it a family madness, a frontier aberration. But the ledgers weren't destroyed. The bones weren't all buried. And the experiments weren't forgotten. They simply changed shape. 1900s. Industrial shadows. By the early 20th century, America had new priorities: railroads, steel, medicine, war. The grotesque rituals of Copper Basin seemed archaic compared to the efficiency of modern industry. Yet letters and ledgers reappeared in strange places. In Chicago stockyards, inspectors whispered of vats where waste was dissolved, producing powders indistinguishable from Caleb's copper. In New Jersey chemical plants, workers reported colleagues who never seemed to sicken from toxic exposure, families with Hartwell blood. In government archives, references to Project Basin were quietly erased from public records but continued appearing in classified files. The methods had modernized. What began as crude sacrifice in tunnels had become a science of extraction, disposal, and transformation. And now, it was scalable. 1940s, war as opportunity. World War II provided perfect cover. Across Europe, atrocities were committed in the name of research. But in America, darker whispers suggested that the network seized this moment to refine its own experiments. Declassified files mention population exposure studies in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Illinois, tests of radiation and chemical tolerance. The families with Hartwell anomalies were often chosen as subjects, their bodies strangely resilient. One chilling memo from 1946 simply read, "Hartwell line proving valuable. Recommend further observation in controlled conditions." Suggest urban relocation for tracking. 1960s. Medical disguises. By the 1960s, the old mines were forgotten. But the network had found a new home. Research labs, hospitals, universities. On the surface, it looked like progress. Studies on nutrition, immunity, resistance to toxins. Behind the scenes, however, certain trials had familiar echoes. Patients unwittingly dosed with heavy metals. Children tested for endurance against chemical exposure. Ashes disposed of in fertilizer shipments, identical to the Hartwell model. The difference now? It was wrapped in white coats, grant money, and government seals. No longer a frontier horror, it was policy by another name. 1980s. Corporate expansion. By the 1980s, multinational corporations had inherited the torch. The Hartwell network, once a clandestine family circle, had morphed into boardrooms and biotech startups. Environmental activists investigating chemical dumping in Appalachia noticed something strange. The same surnames again and again tied to lobbying groups, legal firms, and energy conglomerates. Hartwell was only one of them, but it was a seed that had sprouted into dozens of dynasties. The question wasn't who carried the bloodline. It was who carried the ledger. 2000s. The digital shift. When the internet arrived, fragments of the truth leaked. Old letters surfaced in scanned archives. Family genealogies began to draw lines nobody wanted traced. Forums whispered about the fertilizer families and the copper bloodlines. Each time the information vanished, scrubbed, accounts deleted, forums closed. The same pattern every decade: exposure, suppression, silence. But the map copied by that congressional aide in 1911 resurfaced. A blurred scan appeared briefly on a conspiracy site in 2008 before the page was taken down. It showed not just Appalachia, but dots across the entire country, some overlapping with the headquarters of the nation's most powerful corporations. The Hartwells hadn't disappeared. They had become invisible by becoming normal. 2020s. The uncomfortable present. Today, the story of the Hartwells is told as folklore, an Appalachian ghost tale about caves, ash, and screams in the hills. But in sealed archives and corporate vaults, their presence lingers. Medical patents based on inexplicably resilient genetic samples. Agricultural soil enhancers, suspiciously similar to Caleb's ash. Board members with surnames tracing back to the map of dots. And then there are the families. Still living in hollows, still marked by strange endurance. People who cannot explain why they never get sick, why their blood tests confuse doctors, why they dream of tunnels they've never seen. The Hartwells are gone. But the Hartwell legacy, its science, its methods, its beneficiaries, has simply been absorbed into the fabric of America. The ending that isn't an ending. There is one final record. It sits in the Library of Congress, sealed in a restricted collection. Inside is the original AIDS copied map, annotated in later decades. Some dots are crossed out. Others have been circled in red. The last annotation, dated 1998, is chillingly simple: remaining families integrated. Methods fully normalized. No longer traceable. In other words, the network succeeded. Not by hiding, but by becoming part of everything. And if you think the Hartwells' horror was buried in the tunnels of Copper Basin, remember this: tonight you may eat food fertilized by the ash. Take medicine derived from the bloodline. Drink water filtered through soil seeded with their remains. The Hartwells are gone. But they are also everywhere.